Hi there, welcome along to Taking the Biz, the channel dedicated to A-level business studies students and their revision. If that sounds like you and you're a first time watcher, make sure to subscribe for updates of when new material becomes available. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at inflation, one of the economics topics that's on the new A-level syllabus. We're going to have a look at what inflation is, why it occurs, how it's measured, and then crucially, we're going to have a look at how inflation impacts on business organisations. So inflation is a very simple term to understand. It's quite literally a sustained increase in prices inside an economy. But measuring inflation is a little bit more of a challenge because at any one time there are millions of products and services available inside an economy, and tens of thousands of those might be rising in price and tens of thousands of those might be falling in price, and millions of them might be staying static in terms of their prices. So in order to try and measure inflation as a whole across an economy, the UK government uses a system known as the Consumer Prices Index, or the CPI. And the CPI picks out 600 or 700 of the most commonly bought staples, the most commonly purchased goods and services by most UK households. And that includes a whole range of groceries, products that we might consume during our leisure time, a number of our most common household bills or expenditures, and it tracks what it calls this basket of 600 or 700 different items and tracks whether those products and services are rising in price or whether they're falling in price. Now, even inside this basket of 600 or 700 different goods and services, some of those prices are going to be rising and some of them are going to be falling. So what they do is they measure the basket as a whole and how much the price of that basket of 600 or 700 different groceries and leisure activities and household expenditures, they measure how it has grown or increased compared to the last measurement of the basket in goods. So when we hear news reports saying that inflation has increased by 2%, what that means is this basket of goods that the government tracks through its CPI, the price of it has increased by 2% compared to when it was measured previously. Now, students often assume that inflation or price rises are a bad thing, that they are a negative thing, both for the economy and for businesses. That's not necessarily the case. Inflation, in fact, can actually be seen as quite a positive symptom of the health of the economy. Because if prices are rising in the economy, then it indicates that both consumers and businesses have confidence in how the economy is developing. Firms are only really confident increasing their prices when they feel that the outlook for the economy, the future of the economy, is quite bright. They might increase their prices because they have confidence that over the next 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 months, the economy is going to continue to grow, that it might be quite vibrant, that consumers are going to remain confident enough to go out and spend their money, to loosen their purse strings and to buy goods and services. So when we have inflation in the economy, it's actually a sign of health. The problem comes when inflation actually grows too rapidly, when prices inside the economy actually begin to rise too quickly. And the reason that's a problem is because the relationship between the prices of goods and services and people's incomes, their wages, their salaries. So when inflation is taking place inside an economy, if inflation is happening quite slowly, if prices are perhaps rising by 1 or 2% per year, people's incomes can rise at that same kind of level. So even though we might be going to the shops and the prices of what we want to purchase might have increased, if we've experienced increases in our own pay packets by 1 or 2% as well, then it means that we can continue to sustain the same standard of living that we've been enjoying previously. So if the prices of what we want to buy increases by 2.5%, but we're getting annual pay rises of 2.5% or more, then we can sustain or perhaps even improve the standard of living that we're experiencing. But the problem is that people usually only achieve pay rises once per year, but firms can increase their prices whenever they like. So if people are receiving, say, a 2-3% pay rise, but then prices in the economy over the next year start to increase by 4, 5, or even more percentage points, then it means that people's incomes are not rising as rapidly as prices are inside the economy. That means people can't afford to sustain the same standard of living, and that's when inflation can become difficult for consumers, and as a knock-on consequence may become difficult for firms as well. Now, when we have quite high inflation in an economy, or where we have periods where the prices inside an economy are rising faster than people's incomes are, it means that businesses have some decisions or quandaries that they might find themselves in. The first of that is to do with their own costs, because of course if we've got inflation inside the economy, it's not only us as consumers that are experiencing price rises, it will be firms as well. So this could be costs in terms of the raw materials that they purchase, or the own energy prices that the firms are having to pay, could even be in terms of their labour force as well. And firms have got a very difficult decision to make then about what to do with their own prices. If they're experiencing rising costs, then option one is to keep their prices the same, because they don't want to pass those price rises on to consumers. They know that perhaps due to the price elasticity of what they sell, it might be harmful to them to increase their prices any further. So what the firm's going to have to do there is keep its prices the same when its own costs are increasing, and find that its profit margins on each of its sales is going to be squeezed. The alternative for firms is if they're experiencing their own cost rises because of inflation in the economy, then they may decide to adjust for that by increasing their own prices. So as the firms start to experiencing rises in their own costs, they decide to pass that on to consumers, but then they are risking, depending on the elasticity or the price elasticity of what they sell, they are risking damaging the demand for their goods and services, and they may see drop-offs in sales volume. They might find that then their capacity utilization figures start to dwindle. They might even find that if rivals are taking different measures to them and perhaps leaving their prices the same, they might maybe experience falls in their market share, might affect their economies of scale that they may be benefiting from. So that's a real key decision for firms during periods of high inflation. What's happening to the firm's own costs? Are we going to account for that by perhaps trimming our profit margins, or are we going to try and account for that by passing price rises on to consumers? Key decision for firms when inflation is running quite high. Now, regardless of what firms do with their prices, even if they keep them the same, during periods of high inflation, firms may well experience a fall in demand. And I know that sounds strange, even if they keep their prices the same. But you've got to imagine that during periods of high inflation, it's really affecting consumers. If the prices of what they genuinely purchase are greater than the wages or the salary increases that they might be receiving, then consumers are going to have to start making rational judgments and decisions and sacrifices. There may be things that they choose to trim from their expenditure. And so firms that are selling things that are perhaps less of a necessity and more of a luxury, more of an indulgence, might find that even during periods of inflation, if they keep their prices exactly the same, because consumers are finding that their own incomes are not stretching as far, there may be things that they trim from their weekly or their monthly expenditures, which mean firms start to experience a fall in demand. Now, we might also say that firms are affected by periods of inflation because the consumers that inflation affects are mostly going to have jobs. They're going to work for organisations. They're going to work for firms within the economy. And so when inflation starts to run quite high and it goes to 3% or 4% or 5%, it's quite common then for those workers or their representatives in the form of trade unions to want to open negotiations with employers and start demanding pay increases. When the standard of living of workers starts to dwindle because prices are rising faster than their incomes, it means that they want to start opening negotiations to bargain for greater pay rises. Now again, businesses have a very crucial decision to make here. Either they have to agree to these pay rises And that's going to increase their labour costs, increasing the costs of the organisation, and that brings them back to that first point about whether they're going to pass that on to consumers. Or they have to risk damaging the industrial relations in their firm and perhaps damaging or weakening the relationship that they have with their employees by saying, no, at this time we cannot facilitate greater wage increases, greater salary increases. We're going to have to keep to the agreed salary increases that we'd already put in place. And I'm afraid you as workers are going to have to experience a drop in your living standards, and you're going to have to bear the brunt of the price rises in the economy. That really is a difficult situation for firms to try and navigate. Are we going to experience that rise in costs, which makes us have to think about our own prices, or are we going to try and maintain the cost that we've already got, but potentially tarnish that relationship that we might have been trying to foster with the employees in our organisation? Another decision for firms during periods of inflation is to do with the markets that they're operating in. Because remember, when we've got high levels of inflation inside the UK economy, doesn't mean that those are replicated in other nations throughout the world. It might be that there's other markets that firms could try and target more or prioritise more, where price levels are actually far more stable, and why they might have some inflation, it might be more predictable, and it might be that it's rising at the same kind of rate as incomes inside that economy are as well. So it might mean that during periods of high inflation in the UK, other markets become more attractive to firms, and they might seek to try and export more to these markets because their patterns of inflation are more stable and predictable than they are inside the UK. Perhaps the final thing we could talk about to do with prices and how it affects businesses and their strategies and their decision making is businesses that might be thinking about expansion plans and growth and investment in new capital expenditure projects. Those firms that had been planning to invest in machinery, new plants, new factories, new facilities, maybe new equipment, new vehicles. Inflation and price rises, perhaps rising quite quickly, really inject some indecision into that decision making for firms. They've got to decide, do we want to act quite quickly? And because the prices of things are rising quite fast, do we want to try and expand now? Do we want to try and take account of the fact that we know that the prices of whatever we want to buy to grow and expand are going to be greater the longer we wait? So do we want to try and force through growth and investment now? Or do we actually want to cancel plans for growth and investment? A, because we're concerned about the cost of it as prices are starting to rise, and B, because we're concerned about the validity and the need for it. Are we going to continue to have the demand to warrant growing and expanding our business at a time when prices are rising, consumers' incomes are being squeezed, and we might perhaps be experiencing periods where demand might start to dwindle slightly for our products? So we can see that kind of creates another conundrum, another decision for firms and their managers about, do they continue with their plans for investment but try and force it through quickly before prices rise even further, or do they shelve those plans while they wait to see how the economy continues to develop, and whether they wait to see whether there's actually the demand continuing for their goods and services to make any kind of growth and investment worthwhile. So there we go. We can see that inflation has a significant impact on businesses. It has a greater impact on some than others, depending on the size of the organisation, the industry that they're in, the price elasticity of what they sell. But we can see that it can create some real conundrums for businesses about the timings of decisions, the types of decisions that they're going to make, whether they're going to experience increases in costs, or whether they're going to experience falls in demand as they increase their own prices. So inflation is a real trigger for organisations to think about their strategies and plan decisions about how they're going to deal with inflation and how it's going to impact on their own consumers. We're going to link up in the top hand corner to our videos on deflation, really two topics that we perhaps should be studying side by side. But for the moment, keep on taking the biz. We'll see you soon for another tutorial.